Welcome to Education Forum. I'm Herman Badillo, Vice Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the City University. The improvement of education affects all New Yorkers. This program will focus on the key educational issues and challenges before us all. My guest today is James Straub, who is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and has been for the last year. Prior to that, he worked as a staff writer for the New Yorker. But he has specialized somewhat in the area of education, and he wrote a book called City on a Hill, Testing the American Dream at City College, which has been very important to us at the City University, and which received the Sidney Hillman Award for nonfiction books. And I'd like to talk to you about that. How did you come up with the idea, and how did you start working on this book?
Well, I came up with the idea when I realized this was one of the great social experiments of a period of great social experimentation of the 60s and the 70s.
What was?
Well, no, it's the experiment.
The open admission?
Was open admission. So the idea that you could take an institution which had been an elite institution, and its eliteness had been made possible by being very selective in the way that was true of any elite undergraduate institution, and you could perform the same powerful academic function for students who weren't nearly as fortunate, didn't have nearly the high school preparation or education, and that you could thereby catapult these kids into a much higher level of success than they would have had otherwise. It was a very noble idea. It was accompanied by the most powerful ideals of that era. It's not completely unconnected to some of the ideals behind affirmative action. Here you had City College, a school in the middle of Harlem. Almost no black kids, almost no Puerto Rican kids. Very heavily white, not because of discrimination, but because of those students who were able to meet those standards. Prior to open admissions, of those students who could meet those standards, an overwhelming fraction were white. And that, at the time especially, seemed just an intolerable affront and injustice. And so they drastically changed the admission standards in order to admit a much larger number of minority students.
And what did you do?
So here's what I did. This has obviously been a subject of tremendous debate. It's one of those ideological topics that everybody comes at with a powerful preconception. Either you think it's the end of the world, as many, many people did then and continue to think so, or you think that finally justice has been done, and you don't want to pay attention to the actual consequences because that's a little bit ugly. So I set myself the job of actually going to this school, getting to know the students, getting to know the faculty, sitting in on class, and trying to understand the actual day-to-day reality and to see it as a struggle.
How did you get the professors to allow you to sit in the classrooms?
Well, mostly I think they believed that I was a sympathetic listener. That is, they understood that my intentions were serious. I don't recall having any terrible trouble getting people to agree. I think that, you know, they were very open about it. In general, I think that the institution was very open about having me there because it's a big imposition in a way.
And you did this for about a year.
I started going in the spring of 1992, and I spent a lot of time there in the summer and the whole following year. So I didn't sit in on any one particular class. I sat in at great length on maybe half a dozen classes, so I could understand both the remedial classes at the bottom and also the much more exalted and impressive part of City College, which are quite elevated classes in philosophy and literature and so forth.
All right, so what did you find?
Here's what I found. It's a very powerful and sometimes even heart-rending situation because you have very dedicated and often very talented teachers who really are committed to this ideal. You have students who are there for very serious reasons. Nobody is going to be a member of a Greek letter fraternity. Nobody's going to play football. Nobody's going to hang around. These are kids who need the education and want the education. But of those kids, a large number, especially the ones who came to the New York City public schools, were terribly unprepared. And so there was a terrible struggle between the institution and its standards and the students and their standards. And the question was always, would the institution stoop down to meet their standards? Would it raise the kids up? If it couldn't raise the kids up, what would happen? Would they drop out? Or would they graduate with a not very good education and a not very worthwhile degree? Both of those things happened, as well as many very wonderful success stories, which one is delighted to see.
Now, you talked to a lot of the students, right? What did the students tell you about the problems they found?
Well, the students were often quite candid about it. I mean, I would often meet kids who would say, oh, they're asking me to read all these books in English class, and I've never read a book. I would say, what do you mean you've never read a book? Well, they would say, you know, in high school, I could watch the movie if we were doing a novel. I would read a little piece. I've never read a whole book. And I've never had to write an essay like they're asking me to do, because in high school we only wrote a 5-paragraph essay. That was the biggest thing we ever did in high school.
But these were students who were going to college, so
right.
They would expect that they would have higher
Nobody
standards.
in high school ever told them what they would need. I mean, the high schools had adjusted themselves downwards to meet the students. In a way, you could say that's a similar process to the one I was looking at City College. So the kids had graduated from high school in all too many cases with a dreadful preparation, and it was often in striking contrast to kids who had grown up, say, in Port-au-Prince or Quito or some other place, where they'd gone to much more traditional, rigorous schools. And even though they didn't speak English or didn't speak it well, they had an educational background that, once they got over the linguistic problem, would allow them to have a much greater chance of success in getting a worthwhile diploma than the kids from many of the New York City public schools.
Well, that was my experience when I came here from Puerto Rico at the age of 12. I couldn't speak the language, but when I went to the public schools here, I understood what was going on because I'd already learned it in Puerto Rico.
Right.
So that, therefore, the only question was learning to speak the language. And for that reason, I believe those of us who went to school in another country or another part of the United States like Puerto Rico are able to do better in the school system. Now, what did the professors tell you?
Well, they're really torn about this. I mean, and I understand why they're torn. If you have these kids in your class and you know they're not meeting your own academic standards, what are you going to do? Now, these are incredibly sympathetic kids. You don't want to fail them. So there are several options. You can lie to yourself and say the kids are doing great, and I think a lot of professors do that. You can say, look, I can't fail these kids. It's not right, so you pass them. You can be angry and bitter and fail them all. I don't think too many did that, but some. Or you can really agonize about it, and I think a lot did that. What can I do to help these kids? So I sat in on a remedial class, for example, which I describe at great length, where the teacher was someone who had been there for 20 years. I thought an extraordinary person, and a person who agonized over this constantly. And he wound up, I think, of the 24 kids, maybe he failed 4 or 5. He gave another 6 a kind of conditional pass, meaning if you do work over the summer or next year, I will let you pass. You know, he passed the others. And even as he did it, he said, I know most of these kids are not going to graduate. They don't have the preparation. They're going to fail.
I remember the saddest part of the book was when he said that 2, maybe 3 students deserved to be in college out of that whole group.
Right.
And of course, there were 24.
Right.
So to get the rest of the 22 or 21 ready for college is a massive task.
I think one way of thinking about the question is, what is the kind of deficiency which a college can remedy on the part of an 18 or 19 or 20-year-old kid? And there are answers to that question. There are, you can talk about a gap in a kid's knowledge or something. His math isn't very good. But when it's at a deep cognitive level, when the kid does not know how to think critically about any kind of text, that's very hard for a college to remedy. It should not be the business of a college to have to deal with that problem.
Well, did you come up with any ideas of a solution to the problem?
Well, the ideas that I came up with for a solution are not that different from some of the ones we've been hearing in New York for the last couple of years and some that have been implemented. The mayor, of course, has suggested that there should not be any remedial education at the senior college level at all, that we should use either the community colleges or some other kind of institution which has not yet been specified to help these kids. And obviously the ultimate answer is to make the high schools more rigorous. So of those various answers, I would say a couple things. One is the high schools, thank God, are finally waking up to this, and they are now demanding that kids take what we call Regents classes, which are academic courses, much more than the ordinary ones.
Well, that's the State Board of Regents.
That is the state. It's not New York City. That's the state.
City.
You're absolutely right, demanding those standards, and I think that's a positive. In terms of how the senior colleges should comport themselves, there is no question that there is far too much remediation at the senior college level. Should there be none? I don't know the answer to that. Should, for example, there be classes in second language for students who otherwise don't have academic problems? I think so, but maybe only one level. When I was at City College, there were 3 levels of such classes. So I think that's a matter of degree. You're trying to balance different goods with that. But until you improve the standards of New York City public high school graduates, you cannot deal with this problem.
Well, do you think it's possible to develop a meaningful remediation program?
At the senior college
the
level?
Senior college.
Yes, but I would say a couple things, because there are similar programs at even the most elite institutions. I mean, MIT brings kids in for a summer, for example, to do very, very serious work in physics and calculus and so forth. In order to do it, though, you would have to really, and they, by the way, some of the university colleges do this.
But does MIT bring in students who, as you said, you found in City College, who had really never been asked to write an essay?
Here's the difference. MIT brings in kids who have some gap between their level of preparation and what MIT requires. But MIT has already said these kids can make it with some help. So what you'd have to do is say, identify the kids who can do it with some help, and then make that help very, very intense. In other words, it would be, who knows, maybe, let's say, a 6-week summer school course where you'd be going 5 hours a day and get grounding in these fundamental things you haven't got the grounding in. But again, only for those students who we think can succeed, and presumably that would be decided by the quality of their high school record.
Now, one of the arguments that's made by the people who oppose change is that these are not kids, that these are older people who are married, who have children, who have to work and other responsibilities. What did you find when you spoke to
first,
students?
I think we should distinguish between the moral deservingness of these people, which is very great, and their level of academic preparation. The fact that they're working, they're married, they're raising children, they have jobs, all these things makes them extraordinary as college students, and we want to see them succeed. But whether or not we do, if they are reading at an 8th grade level, we can't help them at a college. They have to be someplace else first. So, and I think the community colleges, by the way, are full of people like that, and especially in New York City you find that.
Have you been to any community colleges?
Only passingly. I don't know nearly as much about the community colleges as I do about the senior colleges. My general impression, and it's really an ignorant one, is that the community colleges here have never succeeded in being quite as vocationally successful and as vocationally oriented as you find in community colleges, for example, out west, where there has always been a greater focus on the community colleges and less of a total focus on the 4-year colleges.
Now, you also have gotten involved with sitting in classrooms in the public school system.
Oh, lots.
Tell us about that.
Well, let's see. Well, that can be a discouraging experience sometimes. I mean,
it doesn't sound to me that you were so encouraged with sitting in the classes at City College.
No, but well, to go back to one thing though, City College has got lots of classes that I loved, that were really high-level discussion among all sorts of different kinds of students, and you were just delighted to be there, and it was great.
Give me an example of those and tell me about what was the ratio between the classes that you were depressed at and the classes that you were inspired by?
Well, the answer to that is that it's a big tail and a small head. So that you don't get that many kids. Now, there is, for example, an entire engineering school at City College. I didn't go to the classes because they wouldn't mean anything to me. It's a very, everyone says it's a very elite, rigorous institution. They once thought about trying to actually have a separate admissions policy and actually making themselves a separate institution. And they are justified in their pride and their achievements. City College turns out an incredible fraction of the minority students who are engineers in this state. So there's a pre-medical program, which is very good. There's an engineering program, which is very good. And because you have quite extraordinary faculty members, you have English classes, philosophy classes, history classes that are terrific. And you're just delighted to see. You wish that could be a higher fraction of what goes on at the school. So that's what I would say of that. So to go back to the public school, I'm sorry.
We have to take a break. We'll be back after this announcement.
When you're small, the world can seem pretty big. But these kids are learning more about it every day. Because in his spare time, Harry Cooper teaches the children in his neighborhood how to use a computer. And every time he does, he puts the whole world in their hands. Couldn't you do something? No, it's not your money. It's you we want. Come on, pick up that phone.
A kid ahead.
My guest today is James Straub, who is a writer for the New York Times Magazine and who is the author of a book called City on a Hill about the City College. But he also has been sitting in classes in the public school system. You started to tell us about that.
Well, it's obviously a really mixed experience because it's a gigantic public school system. And I've certainly been to plenty of classes that I thought were really rigorous and well taught and just terrific. But you also go to too many classes where you feel like the conversation's kind of fuzzy, not enough is being demanded of the students.
What grades are we talking about?
I could say this about high school, or I could say it about elementary school. I mean, there are several things that always keep occurring to me. One is that I don't think enough is being asked of the kids in terms of writing, and in terms of not just writing about themselves, which you find not only in New York City public schools, but in public schools everywhere. There's this whole thing, write about yourselves, tell us about your experience, because that way you can draw upon your own feelings. Well, that's all well and good, but how do kids make contact with real information about the world if everything is focused on this kind of thing? There's an odd, this is again not about New York City, the public schools in general, the New York City as well. There's a strange aversion to factual knowledge, historical knowledge, solid knowledge, as opposed to a kind of fuzzy sense of skills and so on. You don't get to skills except through knowledge.
Tell me about your educational background. Where did you go to the public school?
I was very lucky. I went to all sorts of fancy schools. Yeah. I grew up in the suburbs. I went to high school in Scarsdale, which is, you might as well go to a private school. It's very, very tremendously competitive. And then I went to Harvard and got an undergraduate degree, and that was the extent of my education.
Now, you wrote an article recently on bilingual education
Yeah.
in the New York City school system in Brooklyn. Tell us about that.
Well, this is another one of those, I think, kind of noble-sounding liberal innovations like open admissions that sounds terrific until you encounter it in reality. The way bilingual education works is that you have students who speak Spanish or Russian or Chinese or whatever it is go to class almost entirely in that language, and the notion is that over time they'll learn enough English in other classes to make the transition. Now what happens, and especially with the Spanish-speaking kids, and this is where it really becomes tragic, because the Spanish-speaking kids are the most impoverished, the most disadvantaged, they need school the most.
Now, you sat in on what grade for the Spanish-speaking kids?
The Spanish, well, it was all 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. It was a junior high school.
Okay.
So what you find is that these are the kids who are staying in the bilingual program the longest. They're supposed to transition out in 3 years. It doesn't happen. 3 years is very unusual. It's 4, 5, 6, 7. New York City has some high schools, George Washington High School, for example, which are conducted virtually in Spanish. And many of these kids have been here since they were kids.
They are monolingual schools rather than bilingual schools.
In effect, they are monolingual. And we had until quite recently what was a bilingual or almost monolingual junior college, Hostos, which I suppose still is in many ways. So the system isn't working. Now, there's several reasons. One is there's some kind of ideological opposition which says kids should be able to retain their native culture. But I think more than that, what's happening is that a deep academic problem that many inner city New Yorkers have, all the disadvantages they have which make it hard to learn, is being mistaken for a language problem. These kids' problem is not essentially that they are a second language speaker. These kids have the same problems, cognitive issues that any other kids do, and instead of focusing on those things as you would normally, the focus is much more on providing a kind of linguistic transition or even shelter, which I think is what it tends to be. And so we lose sight of what's fundamental.
Now, did you talk to some of the teachers, and did they tell you
Yeah.
why they were continuing to have bilingual education for 3, 4, 5, 7 years?
There's a couple reasons. One is I think perfectly valid, which is that they see these kids come here as immigrants, and these kids are confused and lonely and disoriented, and they think of the language classes as a kind of safe haven for the kids. And I understand that, because these kids, it's a tough and sad situation for these kids. But I think there are ways of doing that without it being a second language class. You can do that and still teach them English. Now, the other answer you get, but you only get it from the Spanish-speaking classes, not from the Russian or the Chinese, is these kids are so backwards, they're so helpless that they're not going to be able to learn in English. They don't even know their ABCs in Spanish. Now, in the Russian and the Chinese classes, you don't get that because the kids come from a better background.
Are these kids who were born in New York City or kids who were born in South Latin America?
Most in the case of the Russian or the Chinese kids, they've all just come in the last few years. Because once they've been here longer than that, they're gone. Of the Spanish kids, you have a fair number who have been here since they were pretty young. Then you also have a number who just came last year. They came from Mexico, and they are truly among the most difficult students the New York City public school system has to deal with. And I don't have an easy answer for that. Whatever the answer is, it's hard. I don't think bilingualism is the answer, and it's certainly, you know, when you see kids who have been in New York for 6, 7, 8, 9 years and are still in the bilingual class, that class is failing those kids.
Have you talked to any of the parents?
I talked to some of the parents, and what I found was, again, with the non-Spanish speaking parents, you found a strong emphasis on getting the kid out of bilingual as fast as possible, because they know that the kid's future lies in speaking English. I think many of the Spanish-speaking parents, especially the ones from Mexico, for example, they don't know a lot about education. They themselves are not educated. They're inclined to follow the lead of the school itself. So whatever they may think themselves, which probably is not that different from what the other parents think, because they have the same aspirations for their children, they're probably more inclined to follow the lead of the school, and therefore they're maybe a bit more quiescent about it than some other immigrants might be.
Well, you know, I was the chief sponsor of the Bicultural Education Act in Congress in
I do know that.
1974. But the bill that I wrote in Congress had two things, and that is bilingual means two languages, English first and another language,
Right.
not monolingual.
Right.
And secondly, it was supposed to be transitional in nature.
Right.
And if I had said to the members of Congress that I was talking transitional meant 3, 4, 5, or 7 years, never would have been able to get the bill
Right.
through.
Right.
How did it happen, do you think, that the corruption of the concept of bilingual education came to the extent that it has?
It's a very good question. I think several things happened. One is it turned out the kids weren't making the transition as fast as they were supposed to be making the transition, so naturally it just got stretched out. Another was clearly ideological, especially at that time, 20 years ago, but I think also to some extent now. You had this very strong multicultural argument which said you mustn't rob these kids of their native language and culture. Now, the truth is, you can't rob them of their native language. It's not going
they
anywhere.
speak it at home.
Of course. And, you know, parents who care will send their kids to a school after school in order to retain their native language. You see that happening often. But that's been a big argument, and that works against the urgency of transitioning the kids out. So I think the whole question of how urgent and necessary is it has been an important one, and if you don't think it's urgent, and you don't push those kids incredibly hard, you don't push the teachers incredibly hard, it won't happen.
Well, my feeling is that unless there is an improvement in the teaching of bilingual education, that there's a growing movement to eliminate bilingual education, not just from New York City, but throughout the country.
Obviously, we've seen this happen in California. It was a very popular referendum when it was placed in the referendum by this fellow named Ron Unz, who's a local businessman. It got not an overwhelming, got a pretty solid vote among, it got a majority of immigrants, and it got a large number of Hispanic immigrants, though not a majority. And in polls, you consistently find that Hispanic immigrants and all immigrants favor a more monolingual system. They're opposed to bilingual education. So yes, you would think that in the other states where you have large numbers of immigrants, which is to say Texas, Florida, to some extent Illinois, and New York, as well as some of the southwestern states, you're going to be seeing this. New York City has a very entrenched bilingual bureaucracy, and it will be very hard to dislodge it. And we don't have much of a referendum system here to speak of, or not much of one. So I don't know when it's going to come to New York, but I think it will come eventually, and it will come because the parents themselves will insist on changing the system.
What has been the experience in California after the referendum passed?
Well, so far, the experience has been that the people who were the most afraid of disaster have wound up saying, it's not so bad. They found kids learning English faster than they've thought. Now, they've also found that many schools just have ignored the new policy, and they're still teaching kids in Spanish. And indeed, what the policy says is not you can't do it, it's that you can't have mandatory bilingual education. You have to always have an option, and the parents have to have an option. So the record of compliance is somewhat mixed. But more importantly, I think the record of those schools which have changed to a different kind of policy has been more positive than people thought it would be.
Now, finally, you've been looking into the issue of charter schools recently. What have you found about that?
Well, now, this is an interesting question. Now, obviously, we're talking about something being pushed by a different side of the political spectrum. Charter schools, though they do have appeal to liberals and progressives, certainly began as a conservative issue for people who believe in marketplace and choice and so forth. And we now have charter school laws in 35 states. We have 1,200 charter schools. most of them are too new to be able to make a judgment about whether or not it actually makes a difference to the kids and to their learning to have the kind of autonomy and freedom which a school has with charter schools. I have a couple impressions that I try to convey in this article that I wrote. One is autonomy is really important, and there are many great teachers and principals who have been yearning to be able to put their own solid ideas into effect, and charter schools allow them to do that. And so in general, I think the charter school is an important innovation. My reservation, though, is that I do not share with conservatives this view that the marketplace will be as wise in choosing educational outcomes as it is in helping us choose which lawnmower or car or something we want to buy.
What are you worried would happen?
Well, if you say a charter school will allow you to do whatever you think is right, then what you get is everybody's view of what's right. But I don't trust that everybody's view of what's right, whether it's a parent, a teacher, a principal, whomever, is right. So there's something to be said for let 100 flowers bloom, which is what charter schools are doing.
But you still would have the standards being enforced by the Board of Regents in New York State, for example.
And you know, if you have good standards being enforced, then charter schools become one of many ways to help schools achieve that. My own feeling is, though, that if you think that the basic problem with the schools has to do with what goes on in the classroom, with the pedagogy and with the curriculum, then the most direct way of getting at that is to decide what's right, what kind of pedagogy you need and what kind of curriculum you need.
But the problem is getting the Chancellor of the Board of Education in New York City, for example, to agree to change.
Right. So charter schools become a device whereby you can create successful schools that put pressure on the system to change the whole system. It's an indirect way of doing it. So yes, given that, I mean, Diane Ravitch, the educational historian, said to me, if I felt confident that we could change the system in the way that I thought was right, to have a more rich and rigorous curriculum and meaningful tests and so forth, I would say, we don't need charter schools. Let's just make the changes. But I don't feel confident, therefore I say yes to charter schools. So I accept that proviso, but always keeping in mind that the end has to do with changes in the curriculum and in pedagogy.
Unfortunately, we have to stop here. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, Herman.
You can reach us by email at our website, www.cunytv.cuny.edu, to let us know what you think, or write to us at CUNY TV, 25 West 43rd Street, Suite 1220, New York, New York, 10036.